Coming up on Omnivore, are ultra-processed foods really giving us cravings? And designing to reduce packaging waste. This is Omnivore, from the editors of Food Technology Magazine and the Institute of Food Technologists.
This episode of Omnivore is brought to you by IFT membership. To the innovators, the connectors, the changemakers, the future leaders, IFT is your professional home. A global community shaping the future of food. Explore the benefits of membership at ift.org/join.
Welcome to Omnivore from IFT and Food Technology, where we explore the intersection of business, science, and technology in the global food system. I'm Bill McDowell. Ultra-processed foods remain among the most controversial topics in nutrition today. Critics argue that formulations high in fat, sugar, and salt are engineered to override our natural satiety signals, raising concerns about overconsumption and long-term health effects. But without a universally accepted definition of what constitutes a UPF, the science linking these foods to poor outcomes remains unsettled at best, leaving food formulators, policymakers, and consumers with more questions than answers. In this special segment, recorded live at this year's IFT First annual event and expo in Chicago, IFT's consulting nutrition scientist Lisa Sanders sat down with Richard Mattis, Distinguished Professor of Nutrition Science at Purdue University, to unpack what we really know about hyperpalatability, whether evidence supports causal links to disease, and how researchers are working to separate perception from proof.
Super glad to be here with you, Rick, and to talk about this kind of lightning rod topic around ultra-processed foods and hyperpalatability. Just for our audience to try to get us all on the same page, would you mind just talking about ultra-processed food as far as what is it and what is it defined as, and why, there's a lot of discussion around the definition. Why is the definition so important?
Yeah, you would think this would be a simple question with a simple answer, a definition, but it's anything but that. Clearly, NOVA is the most widely cited food classification system, but NOVA itself, the definition entails elements of processing, formulation, sustainability, the introduction of unintended chemicals, economics. They talk about the purpose that food is altered. When you put all of those different dimensions together, it gets very difficult to come up with a simple definition. Now, on top of that, there are multiple other published definitions. Some of the earlier ones, one out of IARC, a committee of WHO. Another one, IFIC has a definition. Barry Popkins' group at UNC had a definition. And those were all based more directly on processing and or food properties that were processed. But the new generation is, I think, looking for more nuanced ways to work off the NOVA system. And so they're looking specifically at category 4, the ultra-processed, but differentiating within that, because there's now a growing body of evidence showing that some foods classified as ultra-processed, like breads and certain grain foods, are really quite healthful rather than harmful. And so they are looking at different ingredients, levels of fat, sugar, and or salt, and other dimensions within the UPF category, and they get a different distribution. Bottom line is there isn't a good definition, and that was reinforced by the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, the 2025 committee that was asked to review this, and their conclusion was because of a lack of definition, it is impossible to draw conclusions about the link to health outcomes.
Okay. So you think this is why, I know recently there's been an announcement that they're going to better define ultra-processed food?
Well, there are a lot of people trying to better define it now. The question is which system will get a toehold and be widely accepted. It will be very difficult for research or for the food industry to implement anything if we can't define what the target is.
So part of the attention to ultra-processed food has been the health implications. So what are some of the health implications of ultra-processed foods?
Yeah, well, gets back to question one. The definition is what determines the health outcome. And so, for example, I think a very insightful study was done just a couple of years ago where they used the Predimed database and they categorized foods using 4 different definitions and then looked at the link between each of those categorization systems and health outcomes. And if I remember correctly, NOVA found an association with BMI, but not with hemoglobin A1C, not with blood pressure, not with total cholesterol. The IARC definition found an association with A1C, but not BMI, not blood pressure, not cholesterol. And the UNC group found an association with blood pressure, but not the other variables. So depending on the system you use, you come up with a completely different set of associations with health outcomes. At this point, I don't think it's possible to draw any logical conclusion because we don't have a definition.
That's a very good point. We have to have the definition's obviously very important. So do we, without a clear definition, and with the fact that some of the definition defines how these health associations are found, do we have sufficient evidence to incorporate ultra-processed foods into dietary guidance?
So there are people that will argue that there is a sufficient evidence base and that we have a very serious set of health problems, metabolic health problems and others, and the time is to act. We can't wait until we understand everything perfectly, of a very reasonable public health approach. I come from a public health background and I'm sympathetic to that, but I don't think we're at that point now. Can you repeat the question just a second?
Just do we have sufficient evidence?
So to me, the sufficient evidence would be a combination of 3 tiers of science. One would be epidemiology. No question, there is an abundance of epidemiologic evidence linking consumption of UPF with a whole array of health outcomes, from Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, you name it. It's a very broad literature. However, if you look at that literature carefully, what you see are those associations are very, very small. They are on the order of, if not even less, than many other drivers of obesity, for example, that we know about, like lack of exercise and stress and poor sleeping habits and so on. This is not the gorilla in the room. The hazard ratios are for UPF are an order of magnitude lower than, say, for cigarette smoking, where we know there's a real association. So they're small. In addition, the EPI has problems because the consumption of UPF didn't change between 2000 and 2020, that 20-year period. But the prevalence of obesity went from about 30% to about 41.2%. So they are not tracking with each other. A third point is in the United States, about 40% of energy from people who consume vegan or vegetarian diets is derived from ultra-processed foods. Those are populations that have longevity, good longevity, and we think better health than many others. But they're eating a lot of UPF, and somehow that's not adversely affecting them. So the epidemiology is abundant, but I think there are some very concerning holes in that evidence. But that's just one level. The second level is you want randomized controlled trials to establish causality. And there have been a couple of educational interventions, none of which has shown a strong association. For those, in all fairness, the degree to which they met their intervention goals is not so strong. But that body of evidence at this point is not strong. We have one metabolic study that was 2 weeks with 20 people and did show an increase in energy intake. However, they also reported a negative slope in energy intake over the 2 weeks. And if you extrapolate that, in another week, the effect would have been gone. So the fact that it's transient, I think, leads to some very serious concerns about where we stand with causality at this point. And the third level is mechanism. If indeed there's an association, how do we intervene? We have to understand the mechanism. So about 3 years ago, 3 years ago, a group of students, one here, Vinny Vallicente, was part of that group. And we did a dive into the literature to identify all the mechanisms that have been proposed. And we came up with a list of about 16 of them. And trying to be as honest with the science as we could not find that there was credible science for any mechanism at this point. But clearly one of the popular ones, and the kind of topic here, is hyperpalatability. You hear that one cited all the time.
So since you're mentioning hyperpalatability as a potential driver or potential mechanism, what exactly is that and how is it being defined? Like, I would think that maybe something that's hyperpalatable to me might not be hyperpalatable to you. So how are they defining and measuring that?
No, you're exactly right, and we're at the same problem with definition. There is no universal definition of hyperpalatable. Hyper is clearly a sensationalist term to raise fear and concern. There is no scientific definition of hyper, let alone hyperpalatable. But the whole concept, my opinion, obviously there are a lot of people who disagree with me on this, but my opinion is that it is lacking in any scientific basis. If you just do casual introspection, take the exact same food and have people rate it cross-culturally. There are places where it will be rated very highly. There will be places where it's viewed as less palatable, less desirable. It's the same food. Right? If you look across the life cycle, the intense flavors that children and adolescents may prefer are not the same intensities and flavors that the elderly like. It's the exact same food, just viewed differently by different populations. And the individual variability, as you point out, is great. Just common example, I'm sure we've all been with people that are drinking coffee, for example. Some like it black. Some like it with cream, some like it just with sugar, some like it with cream and sugar, right? If you were a food company and you were trying to make a coffee beverage, which one would you make, right? There are segments of the population that find any one of those combinations the most palatable, right? So the bottom line is palatability is a characteristic of a person. It's not a property of a food. And so all of these classification systems are based on deifying, that's what I want, making food to be the culprit here, when it's not the food at all. It's our experience with the food and how we rate the food, but it's not the food.
Thank you for explaining that, because that was one of the questions about, are they measuring this by their asking people how palatable something is, or are they using it are they using the components of the food to say that it's hyperpalatable?
It's circular logic, right? I eat it a lot, so it's hyperpalatable. It's hyperpalatable, so I eat it a lot. But there is no objective way of measuring.
Right. And couldn't also possibly, if you're defining it by like the food itself, could you not make something from scratch in your home that's very similar to what you could buy in the store? And wouldn't that also be hyperpalatable if you're defining it as by what components you're putting in the food?
Yeah. There's no question you can have the exact same ingredients in a product that you make at home and one that you make in an industrial setting. They could be rated completely differently. Mm-hmm. And the fact that actually in home cooking, often the family recipe is the gold standard for what's the best, right? You remember going home and your mom making this or that. That's the best. What you get outside are approximations to that. And so absolutely you can have hyperpalatable foods if you're going to label a food made at home.
Since we've talked about hyperpalatability and sort of how they measure it and define it, or the lack of measurement in defining it, is there evidence, or what evidence exists that support that hyperpalatability may be driving some of the intake?
Well, a definition that was proposed, though not adopted, and this was actually Kevin Hall's group that did the work, basically boiled down to identifying sugar, fat, and salt content as being the defining features of hyperpalatable. This audience, I'm sure, recognizes there is a very large graveyard of foods that are high fat, high sugar, and high salt. The fact that they have those ingredients is by no means any guarantee that they're going to be hyper-palatable. But those seem to be what define hyperpalatable foods by their definition.
Richard Mattis is a distinguished professor of nutrition science and director of the Ingestive Behavior Research Center at Purdue University. Lisa Sanders is a registered dietitian, owner of Cornerstone Nutrition, and a consulting nutrition scientist for IFT. Learn more about the latest research and debate on ultra-processed foods in the Journal of Food Science special issue on UPFs, available at ift.org. We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment, but first, this word from our sponsor.
To the curious, to the bold, to the ones shaping the future of food, IFT is where you belong. As a member, you'll enjoy a global community united by purpose, driven by science, and ready to make a lasting impact on our food system. Connect with peers, thought leaders, and trusted experts. Stay on top of cutting-edge research and take your innovations and career further. You belong here. Become a member today at ift.org/join.
Welcome back to Omnivore. I'm Bill McDowell. Packaging waste has become one of the toughest sustainability challenges for the food industry. While recycling, composting, and energy recovery are part of the solution, reuse is emerging as a critical strategy to reduce environmental impact before packaging ever reaches its end of life. Consumers are pressing brands to take action, and regulations are beginning to accelerate change. Science and Technology editor Julie Larson-Brisher spoke with packaging expert Claire Sand about why reuse is gaining momentum, how policy and design are shaping new systems, and what it will take to make reusable packaging a mainstream solution.
So let's dive right in, Claire. I really enjoyed your latest article on reusable packaging. I'd like to explore some of the information you and Dr. Zinat Baz shared in that piece. How are evolving regulations in the US, Canada, and the EU shaping the future of reusable packaging? And what challenges do companies face in adapting to those kinds of different regional requirements?
Oh, that's a great question. Covering a lot of topics. So first I'll talk about regional and then I'll talk about global. But I think one of the things to mention is we do have a lot of regulations, right? I mean, we're inundated daily with, oh gosh, this will be regulated. But until it actually is regulated, we can kind of relax a bit. Yes, we need to prep, right? But until regulations actually happen, usually they go out, 2 or 3 years. And so we do have sufficient time. So first regionally, we have EPR, thankfully, which is Extended Producer Responsibility, and California is a part of it. So there are 7 states in total, including Minnesota, where I live, where we as an industry are focusing on building the recycling infrastructure, basically, for packaging. Part of that, which I'll talk about, is reuse. So Cal Recycle is leading this effort. And the reason I mention California is as the world's the fourth largest economy in the world, which is huge, right? So there are these other states and things like that doing activities in this area, but it's important to realize, SB 54, which is the California EPR regulation, focuses on the minimization of material extraction. And to be considered reusable, packaging must be explicitly designed and marketed for multiple uses, durable enough to function for multiple cycles, and supported by convenient and safe infrastructure. So from a regional standpoint, that's where we're focusing on. We're focusing on California legislation, EPR which will happen in 2032. And we're gearing up for that, focusing on California. And the other states are mimicking, in a way, California legislation. When we look at global, oh boy, it's really complicated, right? But basically, a U.S. export company or a company that exports to another country will need to follow the global guidelines for export. So this involves a lot of reusable transport packaging. So we have been really good in reusable transport packaging. So examples would be crates and pallets, and those are reused a lot. And we've done a great job at that. But what we haven't done a really good job at is really addressing the environmental sustainability of that. So rather than shipping empty pallets around the world, what we really need to focus on is a much more systems approach, which I'll talk about later. If you're a global company, digital tracking is a must, and so that you can track your pallets. Generally, pallets that are reusable or crates that are reusable are more expensive. So tracking them and finding out where they are is really, really important. Dr. Boz at the University of Florida is really doing some in-depth work in this area with compliance with global regulations. Some of the things that are startling to think about as we think about companies that are exporting to the United States, so the EU by 2030, which is only 5 years away, 10% of beverage packaging needs to be reusable, and 40% of transport packaging. So traditionally, if we have exported to the EU, we wouldn't get those crates back, right? That would be difficult, problematic shipping empty pallets and crates back. So we need to align with their systems, their reuse systems, and so that's really, really important, so that they can be reused in the EU, and we somehow get that money back.
Well, and I want to follow up on that, Claire, because part of what you wrote about in the article was that transport packaging, like the crates and pallets, are often seen as more immediate, a more immediate opportunity for reuse, right?
Yes.
So can you talk a little more about the role that digital tools play in making these systems more effective?
Yeah, it's critical. It's absolutely critical. And the cool thing for the food industry is that it really aligns with food safety. So if you're shipping grapes, if you're shipping, meat, what have you, you want to have that traceability of where it's going, what temperature it's seen, for how long period of time. So we do have that ability. We've had that ability for quite some time, but it's absolutely critical. And global geolocation, digital tracking of environmental conditions, it's a must.
Well,
Especially
now, yeah, from your perspective, what needs to happen at that systems level, whether through like design or policy alignment, industry collaboration, so that reusable packaging becomes mainstream and can deliver those real, real world sustainability benefits?
A lot, I guess, in a word. We have, yeah. So a lot needs to happen. I mentioned, the linkage with, let's say, for example, the EU. If you have a reusable pallet, which is required in the EU, you're going to be shipping that pallet to the EU. But do you get that cost of that pallet somehow back? So those type of systems need to be put into place. The fortunate thing here, though, is we do have large global food companies, right? And then we also have large global packaging companies. So that's really an opportunity to connect and align on mutual goals. One of the things we really need to do that I alluded to earlier is to make sure, though, that we are actually lowering the environmental impact and providing food safely to people using reusable packaging. So I think it's a systems problem in that the systems need to align, certainly from a financial perspective, but There's a lot of people who are, resistant to this. And, oh gosh, how can we get around this? So we're going to lose money. But I think the energy would be much more better spent in a positive way, really taking advantage of the global food companies and global packaging. So we can do it, totally viable. We just need to cooperate quite a bit more.
Yeah, well, what are the biggest hurdles in scaling, like consumer-facing reusable packaging? Like deposit return or refill systems? And do you have any strategies that you know of that have shown promise to overcome, consumer participation or infrastructure barriers?
Yeah, one of the things we know about consumers is positive, and I guess in general in life, carrots versus sticks, right? So people love the idea of getting 10 cents back, right? From something, or you donate it to your local school or what have you that you want to donate it to, and then you get the money. So using carrots, making people feel good about returning their bottles, and that's for recycling or reuse. So we do know that using that positive energy is really important. As an industry, though, one of the things we need to get behind is just we have a lot of resistance to new thinking. And I'm often asked what's the most important science innovation in packaging. And in reusable packaging, it's my same answer. It's new ideas. And it's not necessarily, a specific technology, but we need to rethink how we actually package food. And so when we look at reuse, we can focus on transport packaging like crates and pallets and things like that. But you really need to take a step back and look at the whole system from primary packaging, which you were talking about with bottles and things like that. How can we make that returnable? And then how does it change our secondary and our outer packaging cases and crates and things like that? So developing a whole systems approach is really, really critical. And this is a different way of thinking. It's not just saying, oh gosh, we're going to switch to returnable pallets. Okay, well, what opportunities does that allow us then? We're going to have stronger reusable pallets. Well, maybe we can change our primary packaging a little bit more. Maybe we can shift things. Maybe we can lightweight more. Maybe we need to have better palletization of our product or different palletization. So it's an opportunity to think in a more innovative way. I will say, though, the role of food scientists is really critical when we think about packaging or this shift that we're seeing in our industry, because we do need to make sure that food safety and product protection are center stage.
It's been great talking with you today, Claire, and I'll keep watching this space.
Claire Koelsch Sand is the CEO of Packaging Technology and a food technology contributing editor. You can read her co-authored article, Reusable Packaging, Pack, Return, Repeat, in the October issue of Food Technology.
Thank you to this episode's sponsor, IFT Membership. To the scientists, students, collaborators, innovators, and leaders shaping the future of food, you belong here. IFT is your community for trusted knowledge, lifelong learning, and meaningful experiences and connections. Join us today at ift.org/join.
And that wraps up this episode of Omnivore. Thanks again to all our guests and my colleagues at Food Technology. Omnivore is produced and distributed by the Institute of Food Technologists. If you enjoyed today's show and want to learn more about Food Technology Magazine or how to join the conversation by becoming an IFT member, visit ift.org/membership. For more in-depth discussion about innovation in the science of food, check out IFT's other podcast, Side Dish, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. If you have comments or suggestions for future shows, just send us an email. The address is editors@ift.org. For the entire team at Food Technology and IFT, I'm Bill McDowell. Thanks for listening, and join us again for our next episode.